In this episode, we'll be looking at using a plunge router to create both mortises and tenons. Timestamps will be in the description if you want to jump around to the relevant bits to you. I think the first thing to cover is what sort of router should you have for making mortises. As with most things woodworking, it kind of depends. If you're building larger projects, you are going to want deeper mortises, so a larger plunge router with a 1/2 inch collet is going to be the way to go, like this Bosch here. Conversely, a small trim router can be easier to balance on small parts. Something like this small Makita router is going to be perfect if you work mostly on smaller items. Ideally, you'd have both, but for my money, a larger router is more versatile because it can use 1/4 inch and 1/2 inch bits. The key, however, is that you want a plunge router base. While you technically can make mortises with fixed bases, it is considerably more dangerous and less accurate. Dust extraction is also important to consider. Chips at the bottom of a deep mortise getting cut and rubbed over and over it will create a lot of friction and a lot of heat, and it's really easy to have it start smoking on you if you don't remove those chips. Next up is what bits to use. A mortise is cut by plunging straight down, then stepped lateral movements. Ideally, you want a cutter that can handle both these operations. First up is a standard straight bit. It cannot do both these things. If you look closely, the cutter doesn't extend all the way across the bottom. There are workarounds to use these bits, such as drilling out the middle where the bit doesn't actually extend to, or making more shallower passes to deal with it. Alternatively, there are bottom cut straight bits which often advertise a third flute on the end of the bit for this exact purpose. The cost increase is minimal, if at all, and they retain all the other benefits of regular straight bits. I did order one to show off, but unfortunately they sent me the wrong style bit. The ideal bit, in my opinion, is the solid carbide upcut spiral bit. The spiral flutes of an upcut bit push the chips upwards out of the mortise, aiding in dust collection. The downside to spiral bits is that they are pricey and they come in a smaller selection of diameters due to the way that they're manufactured. No matter what type of bit takes your fancy, I'd recommend getting several different sizes for different applications. Just like with chisels for mortises, the majority of the time you'll be making a mortise the width of your bit, then make the tenon to match that. A good range of bits is a 1/4 inch, 3/8 inch and 1/2 inch bit. To demonstrate all of this, I'll be cutting a few sample mortises in this piece of pine. I'll be cutting a 1/2 inch wide by let's say 50mm long mortise. I'm mixing units here because I think metric, but in Australia all our router bits are imperial. If it makes it easier, it's a 13mm by 50mm mortise that we'll be cutting. The rest of the dimensions for this demo really are relatively unimportant. Sometimes you'll want a centered mortise, sometimes you'll want that offset depending on what you're building, so there's no right or wrong way here to mark it out. I'm going to be marking, let's say, the middle of where the mortise is and the start and stop points because I can line up close enough to where I actually want to cut that. With the router unplugged, first I plunge it to kiss the top of the workpiece. I can then zero out the depth stop. This provides me a reference of where I'm starting. From here you can either use the turret stops, or my preference for this is to use the depth stop scale. I want a 20mm deep mortise, so I adjust the depth stop bar to that. Next I can work on getting the edge guide lined up with the center line I marked out. I coarsely adjust that with the screws loosened, then lower the router bit again, and use the micro adjust feature until the leading edges on both the two flutes line up with my line. I like to plunge at the start and stop points of my mortise first. This provides me a different physical feel for when I can't see the line if the router is plunged deeply. Once the start and stop holes are established, I plunge about half the diameter of the bit deep per pass. If it sounds like your router is struggling, particularly in hardwoods, adjust accordingly. The result is a super clean mortise, and there is barely even any dust left behind. You may have noticed that I used some spacer blocks when routing that mortise. The mortise has come out exceptionally clean because the router was very stable. Because these pieces are only about 30mm wide, it's actually quite hard to balance a full-size router on it. If you're using a trim router, it might be a little bit easier, but it's just the nature of the beast. By clamping some pieces in the vise with the workpiece, I've extended the width of the base, and I've also gone past the mortise, so it's a lot easier to balance the router on it. Another thing that's important here is that they're all even on the top. It doesn't really matter if they're the same width or thickness or length. You just don't want to introduce extra wobble because the surface is uneven. I'll be perfectly honest, I don't often make tenons this way. It is possible, and in some instances it is actually the easiest way when you've got very wide and very long stock. But on a day-to-day process, I think there are better ways, and I'll cover those in future episodes. Creating tenons doesn't require plunging, so either a fixed base or plunge base will do. Likewise, the bit only needs to cut laterally, so any type of straight bit will work, as we'll be using a guide bushing. You can even use a template following bit if you want to forgo the guide bushing entirely. In this case, I'll be using the same 1/2-inch spiral upcut bit because it's already installed in the router. The size of the guide bushing isn't important, but remember that will set the offset from the line. In my case, I'll be using a 3/4-inch bushing, which has half the difference from the side of the cutter to the outside of the bushing. That is, I'll be able to get within 1/8 inch or 3.125mm of my line. Using a simple bench hook type jig, clamp your hook to your board, and we can make a test pass to try and set the depth correctly for our tenon. The dimension of this particular tenon is taken from the mortise we cut before. We want to end up with a 1/2-inch thick tenon. At this point, perform a test fit. If it fits in, cut the rest of your tenon back to the line. Using a handsaw, bandsaw or table saw, remove the shoulders of the tenon so it fits in the mortise. Use a chisel to clean up the sawn material. So that you're not trying to fit a square peg in a round hole, either square up the mortise, or the way I prefer to do it, round the tenon with either a rasp or chisel. So why would you use a router for mortises? Plunge router mortises are repeatable, they're reasonably fast, and they're easy to make. Routers are one of the few multi-purpose tools that are incredibly useful, so you really should have a router in your power tool arsenal. With the use of jigs in future episodes, this can be sped up even more, but I think it's important to establish a good baseline. Using a router for tenons works well too. It can be very accurate, though it is pretty slow. Clamping and unclamping is always going to slow down the process. When we switch to the router table in future episodes, you'll see how much faster it can be. Thanks for watching.